I was washing dishes when I heard my daughter-in-law's voice drift from the living room. "Make sure Tommy doesn't mention anything to Grandma Rose," she whispered to my son David. "She doesn't know we're going without her, right?" My hands froze in the soapy water. The plate I was holding slipped back into the sink with a soft splash. I stood perfectly still, my heart beating so loud I was sure they could hear it from the next room. "She won't find out until we're already gone," David replied in that same hushed tone. "It's better this way, Sarah. You know how she gets when she feels left out." "How I get?" I pressed my lips together and forced myself to keep washing dishes, even though my hands were shaking now. They were talking about the beach house vacation we'd been planning for months. The one where I'd already offered to help with groceries and watching the kids while they went out for their anniversary dinner. "Good," Sarah said. "This trip is supposed to be relaxing. We don't need her hovering over everything, telling us how to pack the car or what sunscreen to buy." I set the clean plate in the drying rack and picked up another one. My reflection stared back at me from the kitchen window, a 72-year-old woman who'd apparently become the family burden without realizing it. When had that happened? When had I gone from helpful grandmother to unwanted baggage? The conversation in the living room shifted to something about Tommy's swimming lessons, and I used the distraction to quietly walk upstairs to my bedroom. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the framed photos on my nightstand. There was one from last summer's beach trip, me standing slightly apart from the group while Sarah took the picture. Another from Tommy's birthday party, where I was holding the cake while everyone else posed around the table. In every single photo, I was either behind the camera or on the edges. When had I become the person who documented everyone else's happiness instead of being part of it? That evening, David knocked on my bedroom door and stepped inside without waiting for an answer. "Hey, Mom," he said, sitting down in the chair by my dresser. "Sarah and I were talking, and we think it might be nice if this year's beach trip was just the four of us. You know, give you a break from all the chaos." I looked at him, really looked at him. This was the same boy I'd rocked to sleep every night for the first 3 years of his life because he had nightmares. The same kid who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and make me promise I'd never leave him. "A break," I repeated slowly. "Yeah," he said, already pulling out his phone to scroll through something. "You're always doing so much for us. Cooking, cleaning, helping with the kids. We thought you might enjoy some quiet time at home." The way he said it, so casual and matter-of-fact, made something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't a considerate gesture. This was them finding a polite way to exclude me while making it sound like they were doing me a favor. "When do you leave?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning. Early flight." He didn't even look up from his phone. "We'll only be gone a week." I nodded and smiled, the same smile I'd been giving my family for years whenever they made decisions about my life without asking me first. "Have a wonderful time." After he left, I sat in the silence of my room and tried to remember the last time someone in this house had asked me what I wanted instead of telling me what was best for me. I couldn't think of a single instance. The next morning, I stayed in my room while they packed. Through my bedroom window, I watched David load suitcases into the car while Sarah chased the kids around the driveway, making sure they had their tablets and snacks for the flight. Tommy kept looking back at the house, and I wondered if he was thinking about me. When they were almost ready to go, Sarah came upstairs and knocked on my door. "Rose? We're heading out now." I opened the door, and she gave me that bright, artificial smile she always used when she felt guilty about something. "Thanks so much for watching the house while we're gone. You're a lifesaver." Watching the house. Like I was the neighbor they'd asked to water their plants, not the woman who owned this place. "Drive safely," I said. She hugged me quickly, the kind of hug you give someone when you feel obligated to do it, then hurried back downstairs. David honked the horn twice from the driveway, his version of saying goodbye. I watched from the living room window as they drove away. Tommy's face appeared in the back window for just a moment, and I waved even though I wasn't sure he could see me. When the car disappeared around the corner, I walked through the empty house and noticed how different it felt without their noise and chaos filling every room. For the first time in months, I could hear myself think. I made myself a cup of coffee, real coffee from the good beans I kept hidden in the back of the pantry because Sarah always complained they were too expensive, and sat down at the kitchen table. The morning light was streaming through the windows, highlighting all the little changes they'd made to my space over the years. Sarah's motivational quotes stuck to the refrigerator. David's work papers scattered across the counter. Their mail mixed in with mine, their dishes in my cabinets, their rules about how to load the dishwasher and when to run the washing machine. When had my house stopped feeling like mine? I finished my coffee and walked to the small office where I kept all my important papers. The filing cabinet was locked, just like my late husband Frank had always insisted it should be. Inside, in a folder labeled Property Documents, I found what I was looking for. The deed to the house. Only my name was on it. Rose Margaret Chin, sole owner. I stared at that document for a long time, reading every word carefully. Frank and I had bought this house 35 years ago with money we'd saved from his job at the post office and my work at the elementary school. We'd raised David here, celebrated every holiday, weathered every storm. When Frank died 8 years ago, the house became mine alone. Somewhere along the way, I'd started acting like I was a guest in my own home. When David lost his job 3 years ago and asked if his family could move in temporarily, I'd said yes without hesitation. Temporary had turned into permanent, and I'd gradually handed over control of everything from grocery shopping to decorating to deciding what we watched on television. I'd become invisible in my own life. That afternoon, I drove to the hardware store and bought new locks for every door in the house. The young man behind the counter asked if I needed help installing them. "No, thank you," I said. "I know how to use a screwdriver." Back home, I started with the front door. I unscrewed the old lock, the one David and Sarah used every day without thinking about who actually owned the house they were walking into. The new lock was solid and clean, and when I tested the key, it turned smoothly. I did the same for the back door, the side door, and the door that led from the house to the garage. Every lock that had given them easy access to my space, I replaced. When I was finished, I gathered up all the old locks and threw them in the garbage bin outside. Then I walked through the house and really looked at it for the first time in years. Sarah's decorative signs about family and love were hanging on walls I'd painted myself. Her throw pillows were arranged on the couch Frank and I had picked out together. Her coffee mugs were taking up space in the cabinets where my wedding china used to be displayed. I started in the kitchen, taking down every cutesy saying she'd hung up without asking me. Live, laugh, love went into the trash, along with good vibes only and a wooden sign that said this kitchen is seasoned with love. I didn't need signs to tell me how to feel in my own house. Next, I went through the living room and removed all the decorative pillows she'd bought in colors that didn't match anything else in the room. Into the garbage they went, along with the fake plants she'd scattered around because she said real ones were too much work. I opened every window in the house and let fresh air flow through the rooms. For the first time in months, the place smelled like itself again instead of Sarah's vanilla candles and air fresheners. That evening, I called my friend Margaret and invited her over for dinner. We sat on my back porch with glasses of wine and the kind of cheese I never bought anymore because David always complained about the smell. "You seem different," Margaret said, studying my face in the fading light. "Lighter somehow." I took a sip of wine and looked out at the garden I used to tend before Sarah decided the vegetables were too messy and convinced me to plant boring flowers instead. "I think I forgot who I was for a while." "And now you remember?" I thought about that question as we sat in comfortable silence, listening to the evening sounds of the neighborhood. Did I remember who I was? Or was I finally ready to find out who I could become when I stopped trying to make everyone else comfortable at the expense of my own peace? The motion sensor light by the garage flickered on as a cat walked through the yard, and I realized I wasn't waiting for headlights in the driveway anymore. I wasn't listening for the sound of their key in the lock or wondering when they'd come home and fill my quiet house with their noise again. For the first time in 3 years, I was exactly where I belonged, and nobody could walk through my door unless I invited them in. 3 days later, I was reading in the living room when I saw headlights sweep across the front windows. My heart gave a small jump, but I didn't move from my chair. I'd been expecting this moment since I changed the locks. Car doors slammed outside, followed by the familiar sound of David's voice telling the kids to stay in the car while he figured out what was wrong with the door. I heard the jingle of keys, then the frustrated rattle of the front door handle when the lock didn't turn. "What the hell?" Sarah's voice carried clearly through the evening air. "David, something's wrong with the lock." I set my book down and walked quietly to the kitchen window where I could see them without being seen. David was bent over the front door, trying his key again and again. Sarah stood behind him with her arms crossed, tapping her foot in that impatient way she had when things didn't go according to her plans. "Maybe it's just stuck," David said, though his voice already carried a note of uncertainty. "The humidity sometimes makes these old locks tricky." He tried the key one more time, then stepped back and pulled out his phone. I watched my own phone light up on the counter, but I didn't answer it. A minute later, it buzzed with a voicemail notification. Sarah was pacing now, gesturing toward the car where I could see Tommy and little Emma waiting in their car seats. "This is ridiculous," she said loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. "Call her again." David tried calling twice more while I stood in my dark kitchen, watching them grow more frustrated by the minute. Finally, Sarah marched around to the back of the house, and I heard her try the back door. When that didn't work either, she came back to the front looking genuinely angry. "She changed the locks," Sarah announced, her voice sharp and accusatory. "Rose changed the damn locks while we were gone." The way she said my name, like I was a misbehaving child who'd done something spiteful and unreasonable, made my jaw clench. But I stayed where I was, hidden in my own kitchen, watching them realize they had no power here anymore. David tried calling me one more time, then left another voicemail. This time his tone was different, less casual, more careful. After 20 minutes of standing on my front porch looking lost, they got back in their car and drove away. I waited until their taillights disappeared before I allowed myself to smile. The next morning brought a different kind of visitor. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock, and when I opened it, I found a woman in a business suit holding a clipboard and briefcase. "Mrs. Chin?" "I'm Jennifer Walsh from Morrison & Associates Legal Services. I believe your daughter-in-law Sarah contacted our office about a property dispute?" I looked at the papers she was trying to hand me, something official looking with lots of legal language. "There's no dispute," I said calmly. "This is my house." "Yes, well, Mrs. Patterson, Sarah, claims that she and her family have established residency here and have certain tenant rights that would require proper notice before any lock changes or..." She paused, clearly reading from a script she'd memorized. "Mrs. Patterson can claim whatever she likes," I interrupted. "But this house belongs to me. Would you like to see the deed?" The lawyer's confident expression faltered slightly. "Well, yes, that would certainly help clarify the situation." I invited her in and retrieved the deed from my filing cabinet. She examined it carefully, then looked up at me with a different kind of respect in her eyes. "Mrs. Chin, this clearly shows you as the sole owner of this property. Your family members would be considered guests, not tenants with legal rights." "That's what I thought," I said, taking the deed back and placing it safely in its folder. After the lawyer left, I sat down at my kitchen table and really thought about what Sarah had tried to do. She hadn't just been annoyed about the locks, she'd actually tried to use the legal system to force her way back into my house. The audacity of it took my breath away. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went through David's old room, which had become his and Sarah's bedroom, and started looking through the papers scattered on the dresser and nightstand. I wasn't snooping, exactly, more like investigating what kind of people I'd been sharing my house with. Hidden in a stack of bills and school forms, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a printed email chain between Sarah and someone named Jennifer Morrison, not the lawyer, but a real estate agent. The subject line read, "Potential listing spring market analysis." I read every word twice to make sure I understood what I was seeing. Sarah had contacted a realtor 6 months ago asking about listing my house for sale. She described it as a family property that would be coming available in the spring and wanted to know what it might sell for in the current market. The realtor had responded with enthusiasm, suggesting they could list it for significantly above market value given the desirable neighborhood and the fact that it was a heritage property that had been in the family for decades. Sarah's response made me feel sick. Perfect. We're hoping to relocate out of state once everything is finalized and we have full ownership established. The current owner is elderly and we expect the transition to be smooth. The current owner is elderly. Like I was some confused old woman who didn't understand what was happening to her own property. I sat in that bedroom, my bedroom, in my house, and tried to process the full scope of what they'd been planning. This wasn't just about excluding me from a vacation. They'd been systematically working toward pushing me out of my own home so they could sell it and move away with the money. How long had they been planning this? How many conversations had they had about my house, my future, my life, without including me? How many times had Sarah smiled at me over dinner while secretly calculating how much money my home would bring them? I took pictures of every email with my phone, then put the papers back exactly where I'd found them. But I kept the photos. That evening, David called again. This time I answered. "Mom, what's going on?" His voice was strained, tired. "We can't get into the house." "Did something happen to the locks?" "The locks are fine," I said. "They're just new." There was a long pause. "New? Mom, we live there. You can't just change the locks without telling us." "It's my house, David. I can change whatever I want. But our stuff is in there. The kids' toys, our clothes, everything we own." I almost felt sorry for him then. He sounded genuinely confused, like he couldn't understand how this situation had developed. But then I remembered the emails, and my sympathy hardened into something colder. "Where are you staying?" I asked. "We're at the Comfort Inn on Route 9. "Mom, this is crazy. What's this really about? Are you mad that we went on vacation without you?" "This isn't about the vacation, David." "Then what? Help me understand what's happening here." I took a deep breath. I found Sarah's emails to the real estate agent. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Mom, I can explain." "Can you? Can you explain why my daughter-in-law was planning to sell my house without telling me? Can you explain why she described me as an elderly owner who would be easy to push aside?" "It wasn't like that. We were just exploring options. Nothing was decided." "Options for what, David? Options for stealing my home?" "We would never steal from you. We were thinking maybe you'd want to downsize, move into one of those nice senior communities. We thought the money from the house could help you afford a really nice place." The casual way he said it, like they'd been doing me a favor by planning my future without consulting me, made me angrier than I'd been in years. "You thought wrong," I said, and hung up. The next morning, I called the real estate agent whose name was on those emails. When I explained who I was and what I'd discovered, there was an awkward pause. Mrs. Chin, I had no idea Sarah wasn't authorized to discuss the property. She led me to believe she was handling real estate matters for the family. She was handling nothing for me, I said firmly. This house is not for sale, and Sarah Patterson has no authority to speak about my property. I understand completely. I'll make sure to remove this from our potential listings and won't engage in any further communication with Mrs. Patterson about your property. After I hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, completely in control of my own life. That afternoon brought another surprise. I was watering the plants on my front porch when I heard a small voice call my name. I looked up and saw Tommy running across the front yard toward me, his little legs pumping as fast as they could carry him. "Grandma Rose," he called, and threw himself into my arms with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded me why I'd loved being a grandmother so much. Behind him, David was walking more slowly, looking uncertain and defeated in a way I'd never seen before. "I asked if I could see you," Tommy said, his face pressed against my shoulder. "Daddy said maybe for just a few minutes." I held my grandson tight and looked over his head at my son. David's eyes were red-rimmed, and his clothes looked like he'd slept in them. "Where's Sarah?" I asked. "She left," David said quietly. "Took Emma and went to her sister's place in Portland. Says she's done with all this drama." I wasn't surprised. Sarah had never been the type to stick around when things got difficult. "Can I come inside and see my room?" Tommy asked. I left my favorite dinosaur book. I looked at David, who nodded slightly. "Just for a few minutes," I said. As we walked toward the front door, I noticed David hang back, like he wasn't sure he was welcome. Good. He should be uncertain now. He should understand that walking into my house was a privilege, not a right. Tommy ran straight to what had been his bedroom and emerged a few minutes later clutching a well-worn book about velociraptors. But instead of being excited about finding his book, he looked confused and a little sad. "Grandma, where are all my other toys?" I glanced at David, who was standing awkwardly in my living room looking at all the empty spaces where Sarah's decorations used to be. "They're packed away safely," I told Tommy. "Sometimes when people move around, toys need to wait in boxes for a while." He nodded like that made sense to him, but I could see he was trying to figure out why his family was suddenly living in a hotel instead of with me. After they left, I found something Tommy had dropped on his way out, a small piece of paper folded into a tiny square. When I opened it, I saw a drawing he'd made of our family. There was me, clearly labeled Grandma Rose in his careful 7-year-old handwriting. There was him and Emma, David and Sarah, all standing in front of a house with a big tree in the yard. But in Tommy's drawing, I wasn't standing off to the side or behind everyone else. I was right in the center, with everyone gathered around me. That's when I realized that while the adults in this family had been playing games and making plans and treating me like an inconvenience, Tommy had always seen me exactly as I was, the heart of this family, the one who held everything together. I folded his drawing carefully and put it on my refrigerator, right where Sarah's motivational quotes used to be. For the first time since this whole mess started, I cried. Not because I was sad, but because I finally understood the difference between being needed and being valued. Tommy valued me. David needed me, but only when it was convenient for him. And Sarah? Sarah had never done either. For days into their motel stay, David showed up at my door alone. It was nearly midnight, and I could see him through the peephole standing on my front porch in an old jacket, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a teenager who'd missed curfew. I didn't open the door right away. I stood there in my robe and slippers, watching him through the glass, and tried to decide if I was ready for whatever conversation was about to happen. When I finally unlocked the door and opened it, the first thing I noticed was how different he looked. His hair was messy, his eyes were bloodshot, and he had the defeated posture of someone who'd run out of options. I didn't know where else to go, he said before I could speak. Sarah's not coming back. She filed for divorce yesterday. I stepped aside to let him in, not because I felt sorry for him, but because standing in the doorway having this conversation felt too exposed. He walked into the living room and sat heavily on the couch, putting his head in his hands. She said I had to choose between being her husband and being your son, he continued, his voice muffled. She said what kind of man lets his mother lock his family out of their own home? It was never your home, David. He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his face I hadn't seen in years, the boy he used to be before he learned to prioritize other people's comfort over doing what was right. I know that now, he said quietly. I think I've known it for a while, but I kept pretending it didn't matter. Sarah made it easy to pretend because she wanted this house so badly, and I wanted to make her happy. I sat down in Frank's old armchair, the one David used to climb into when he had nightmares as a child. Tell me about the real estate emails. His shoulders sagged even further. That was all Sarah's idea. She said you were getting older and it would be better for everyone if you moved somewhere with more support, maybe one of those retirement communities with activities and nurses on staff. Without asking me what I wanted. She said you'd resist the idea at first, but once you saw how nice those places could be, you'd be grateful we'd helped you make the transition. He rubbed his face with both hands. She made it sound like we'd be taking care of you, not taking advantage of you. And you believed that? I wanted to believe it, he admitted. It was easier than admitting we were planning to profit from pushing you out of your own home. We sat in silence for several minutes. Outside, I could hear the neighbor's sprinkler system cycling on, the soft spray of water hitting the fence between our yards. Normal nighttime sounds in a normal neighborhood, while inside my living room, my son was finally telling me the truth about how little my feelings had mattered to the family I'd been supporting for 3 years. Where are you staying now? I asked. My car, mostly. Sometimes the motel if I have enough cash, but that's expensive and... He trailed off, looking embarrassed. And Sarah took most of the money when she left. He nodded. She said she needed it for the kids, to get settled at her sister's place. I didn't fight her on it. I studied his face, looking for signs that this was another manipulation, another attempt to make me feel guilty enough to hand over my keys and pretend none of this had happened. But what I saw was genuine shame and exhaustion, and something else, a kind of clarity that had been missing from his eyes for years. The garage has a small bathroom and a space heater, I said finally. There's a folding cot in the storage closet. You can sleep there tonight, but the house stays locked. Relief washed over his face so quickly it was almost painful to see. Thank you. I know I don't deserve it. You don't, I agreed. But Tommy doesn't deserve to have his father sleeping in a car. The next morning, I made coffee for 2 and carried a cup out to the garage. David was sitting on the edge of the cot, fully dressed, looking like he hadn't slept much. Thank you, he said, accepting the coffee gratefully. For last night, and for this. We drank our coffee in the quiet of the early morning, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like he was waiting for me to do something for him or fix something for him. He just seemed grateful to be sitting in a safe place with a warm drink. I need to ask you something, I said. And I want you to think before you answer. He nodded. When you moved in here 3 years ago, what did you think was going to happen? Long term, I mean. David was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup. Honestly? I thought you'd be so happy to have us here that you'd eventually sign the house over to us. Sarah kept saying how lonely you seemed, how much you needed family around you. I wasn't lonely, David. I was invisible. There's a difference. I see that now. He looked up at me. I see a lot of things now that I didn't want to see before. Over the next week, we fell into a strange routine. David would sleep in the garage and spend his days looking for work in an apartment he could afford on his own. I would make extra coffee in the morning and sometimes dinner in the evening, which we'd eat on the back porch where we could talk without the weight of being inside the house where so many bad decisions had been made. He told me about the job he'd lost 3 years ago, not because of budget cuts like he'd claimed, but because he'd been consistently late and unreliable. He told me about the credit card debt he and Sarah had hidden from me, and how they'd been counting on selling my house to pay it off and start fresh somewhere else. We had it all planned out, he said one evening as we watched the sun set behind the trees. Sarah found this development in Arizona where houses were cheap and the weather was good year-round. We were going to tell you it was for your health, that the dry air would be better for you. Even though I've never had any health problems that would benefit from dry air. Even though, he confirmed. We had an answer for everything, a reason why every part of the plan was actually for your benefit. The more he told me, the more I understood how completely they'd been planning to erase me from my own life. It wasn't just about the house, it was about convincing me that I was too old, too fragile, too much of a burden to make my own decisions. Why are you telling me all this? I asked. He was quiet for a moment, watching a neighbor walk their dog past our fence. Because I'm ashamed of who I became, he said finally. And because I want you to know that I remember who I used to be. Who were you? I was the kid who brought you dandelions from the yard and called them flowers. I was the teenager who walked you to church every Sunday after Dad died because you said it felt safer with someone beside you. I was the man who called you every day when I lived across town just to check in and see how you were doing. I remembered all of those things. I also remembered the gradual change, so slow I hadn't noticed it happening. The phone calls becoming less frequent. The visits becoming shorter. The way he'd started looking to Sarah for approval before making any decisions, even ones that had nothing to do with her. When did that change? I asked. When I started caring more about what Sarah thought of me than what I thought of myself, he said. She had this way of making everything seem reasonable, even when it wasn't. And I wanted her to be happy, so I let her convince me that you were the problem instead of facing the fact that we were taking advantage of you. That night, after David had gone to sleep in the garage, I sat in my living room and thought about forgiveness. Not the quick, surface kind that pretends nothing happened, but the slow, careful kind that acknowledges damage and asks whether it can be repaired. Could I forgive my son for prioritizing his wife's greed over my dignity? Could I trust him to be honest with me after years of lies and manipulation? Did I want to rebuild a relationship with him, or was I better off maintaining the boundaries I'd created? I didn't have answers to any of those questions yet. But for the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like I had time to figure them out without pressure from anyone else. The next morning, David knocked on the back door instead of waiting for me to bring coffee to the garage. I found an apartment, he said when I let him in. It's small and it's not in the best neighborhood, but it's mine. I can move in next week. I poured him coffee and waited for him to continue. I wanted to ask if Tommy could visit you sometimes. Not move back in, just visit. Sarah's going to have primary custody, but I get him every other weekend and some holidays. I thought about Tommy's drawing, still hanging on my refrigerator. He can visit, I said. But you stay the whole time. No dropping him off and leaving. Of course. And David? No more lies. Not about money, not about your job, not about anything. If you can't be honest with me, then you can't be part of my life. He nodded solemnly. I understand. Do you? Because this isn't just about saying the right words. This is about proving, over time, that you can be trusted again. I know, he said. And I know I might not get the chance to prove it. But I'd like to try. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw something I hadn't seen in years. He looked like himself again, not like the person Sarah had wanted him to be. The change wasn't complete, and I wasn't sure it would last, but it was a start. "We'll see," I said. "One day at a time." David moved into his apartment on a Tuesday, taking only the clothes and personal items I'd packed into boxes for him. Everything else, the furniture, the decorations, the life he'd built in my house, stayed behind in the garage until he figured out what he actually wanted versus what Sarah had convinced him he needed. For 2 weeks, my house was completely quiet again. I spent my days rediscovering routines I'd forgotten, reading in the morning without someone asking me to make breakfast, watching the news without commentary about how depressing it was, eating meals at whatever time I felt hungry instead of when everyone else expected dinner. The silence felt different now than it had before David's family moved in. Then, it had been the loneliness of empty rooms waiting to be filled. Now, it was the peace of a space that belonged entirely to me. On a Saturday afternoon in early October, David called to ask if he could bring Tommy for a visit. "He's been asking about you every day," David said. "He wants to know when he can see his Grandma Rose again." An hour later, I watched from my front window as David's car pulled into the driveway. Tommy bounded out before the car had completely stopped, running toward the house with a backpack bouncing on his shoulders. "Grandma," he called, and I opened the door just in time to catch him in a hug that nearly knocked me backward. "I missed you so much," he said, his face pressed against my shoulder. "I drew you pictures every day." David followed more slowly, carrying a small cooler and looking uncertain about whether he was welcome beyond the front porch. "Come in," I said, and his relief was visible. Tommy immediately began pulling crumpled drawings from his backpack, spreading them across my coffee table like treasures. There were pictures of dinosaurs, pictures of houses, pictures of the three of us, him, David, and me, doing various activities together. "This one is us making cookies," he explained, pointing to a drawing where stick figures stood around something that might have been a kitchen counter. "And this one is us reading books. And this one is us planting flowers." I studied each drawing carefully, noticing that in every single one, I was included as a central figure, not an afterthought. In Tommy's world, I wasn't invisible. I was essential. "These are beautiful," I told him. "Would you like to help me hang them on the refrigerator?" While Tommy arranged his artwork, David stood awkwardly in my kitchen, looking around at the changes I'd made. The motivational signs were gone, replaced with photos of Frank and me from our younger years. The decorative bowls Sarah had favored were gone, replaced with functional items I actually used. "It looks like your house again," he said quietly. "It feels like my house again." We spent the afternoon doing simple things. Tommy and I baked cookies while David sat at the kitchen table and actually participated in our conversation instead of scrolling through his phone. We played board games in the living room. We took a walk around the neighborhood, and Tommy held my hand the entire time, chattering about school and his new bedroom at David's apartment. "It's smaller than my old room," Tommy said, "but Daddy says smaller means cozier. And I have my own window where I can watch the birds." As the day wore on, I noticed changes in David too. He seemed more present, more engaged with his son. Without Sarah there to direct every conversation and activity, he was more like the father I remembered him being when Tommy was younger. When it was time for them to leave, Tommy hugged me tightly and asked when he could come back. "Next weekend, if your father brings you," I said, looking at David. "Can we make pancakes next time?" Tommy asked. "I remember you used to make really good pancakes." "I still do," I assured him. After they left, I walked through my house and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Not the desperate happiness of someone trying to convince themselves everything was fine, but the quiet satisfaction of someone whose life finally made sense. Over the following months, our Saturday visits became a regular routine. Sometimes David would stay for the whole day, and we'd work together in my garden or repair small things around the house. Other times, he'd drop Tommy off and run errands, picking him up before dinner. I began to see glimpses of the man I'd raised, the one who noticed when I was tired and would quietly start washing dishes without being asked, the one who listened when I talked instead of waiting for his turn to speak. One Saturday in December, David arrived with Tommy and a small evergreen tree in a pot. "We thought maybe you'd like to decorate for Christmas this year," David said. Tommy picked out the tree. I hadn't decorated for Christmas since Frank died. Sarah had always insisted on handling the holiday decorations, filling my house with her preferences instead of the ornaments that held memories for me. "I'd like that," I said. We spent the afternoon hanging ornaments I hadn't seen in years, the paper angels Tommy had made in kindergarten, the wooden snowflakes Frank had carved, the collection of glass birds I'd inherited from my mother. Tommy was fascinated by the stories behind each decoration, and I found myself sharing memories I'd kept locked away. "Tell me about this one, Grandma," he said, holding up a faded felt stocking with David embroidered in crooked letters. "Your daddy made that when he was 7 years old," I said. "He was so proud of it that he wanted to hang it up in July." David laughed, a real laugh, not the polite chuckle I'd grown used to hearing from him. "I remember that. I thought Christmas decorations should stay up all year. You cried when I packed them away," I said. "So we made a deal that you could keep one ornament in your room year-round." "The wooden reindeer," David said immediately. "I still have it." As we decorated the tree together, I realized this was what I'd been missing all those years when Sarah took over the holidays. Not just the decorating, but the sharing of memories, the connection between past and present, the feeling of creating something together instead of having someone else's vision imposed on my space. That evening, as we sat around the tree with mugs of hot chocolate, Tommy curled up against my side and asked, "Grandma, are you happy now?" The question surprised me with its directness. I looked at my grandson's serious face, then at David, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Yes," I said, and realized it was completely true. "I'm happy now." "Good," Tommy said, snuggling closer. "I like it when you're happy." On Christmas Eve, David called to ask if he and Tommy could come for dinner. Sarah had taken Emma to Portland to spend the holiday with her sister, and David didn't want Tommy to spend Christmas alone in an apartment. "We could cook together," he suggested. "Like we used to when I was a kid." I agreed, and we spent Christmas Eve afternoon preparing a simple meal: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from my garden that I'd frozen in the fall. Nothing fancy, but everything made with care and attention. As we worked together in the kitchen, I noticed how naturally we moved around each other, David anticipating when I needed help and offering it without being asked. Tommy sat at the kitchen table, coloring in a new book and chattering about what he hoped Santa would bring. "I asked for Legos," he said, "and books about sharks, and for Mommy and Daddy to be friends again even if they don't live together anymore." David and I exchanged glances over Tommy's head. Out of the mouths of children came the kind of wisdom adults spent years trying to figure out. During dinner, Tommy asked me to tell stories about Christmas when David was little. I found myself sharing memories I hadn't thought about in years: the year David convinced me that Santa needed cookies and milk for each reindeer, not just himself, so we ended up leaving out dozens of cookies. The Christmas morning when he woke up at 4 a.m. and couldn't understand why he had to wait until the sun came up to open presents. "You were very determined," I told Tommy. "Your daddy always knew exactly what he wanted and wasn't afraid to ask for it." "Like you," David said quietly, looking at me. "I get that from you." After dinner, we sat by the tree and exchanged small gifts. I gave Tommy a set of books about dinosaurs and David a photo album I'd put together, pictures of him from childhood through adulthood, including some from the past few months of our Saturday visits. David's gift to me was unexpected, a small wooden box he'd made in a woodworking class he'd started taking in the evenings. "It's for your important papers," he said. "The deed, insurance documents, whatever you want to keep safe." Inside the lid, he'd carved a simple inscription, "For Rose, who taught me that home isn't a place you take, it's a place you build." I ran my fingers over the smooth wood and felt tears gather in my eyes. Not sad tears, but the kind that come when someone shows you they truly understand something important about who you are. "Thank you," I said. "It's perfect." As the evening wound down and Tommy began to yawn, David helped me clean up the kitchen while Tommy dozed on the couch. "Thank you for today," David said as we worked side by side. "And for all the Saturdays. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful for the chance to earn it." I handed him a dish to dry and considered his words. "Forgiveness isn't something you earn," I said finally. "It's something you accept when it's offered. But trust, that's different. Trust has to be built, one day at a time. And are we building it? Trust, I mean." I looked at my son, seeing the man he was becoming rather than focusing on the mistakes he'd made. "Yes," I said. Slowly, but yes. That night, after David and Tommy had gone home, I sat by my Christmas tree and thought about the year that was ending. 12 months ago, I'd been invisible in my own life, accommodating other people's plans and pretending their comfort mattered more than my dignity. Now, I was exactly where I belonged, in my own house, on my own terms, with relationships based on honesty rather than convenience. The tree lights blinked softly in the darkness, and I could smell the faint scent of pine and the lingering aroma of our Christmas dinner. This was what contentment felt like, not the absence of problems, but the presence of peace. I was Rose Margaret Chin, homeowner, grandmother, woman who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in her own life. I was no longer waiting for permission to exist in my own story. I was home.